The morning Myrtle Sutton rode onto the Merritt ranch with nothing but a carpetbag, a letter of introduction, and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from having nothing left to lose. 3 pairs of hostile eyes watched her from the fence line like she was a storm cloud rolling in over good grazing land. It was the spring of 1878, deep in the Texas hill country, and the air smelled of cedar and dry earth and something wild that no amount of civilization had yet managed to tame. The Merritt spread was one of the finest cattle ranches in Kerr County, and Jacob Merritt had run it with nothing but his 2 calloused hands and his 3 sons for the 4 years since his wife Eleanor had died of fever and taken every soft thing in his life with her. He had not asked for a housekeeper. He had not asked for help of any kind. But his sister in San Antonio had taken it upon herself to place an advertisement in the newspaper, and Myrtle Sutton had answered it, and now here she was, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a plain bonnet, sitting straight-backed on a borrowed horse like she had ridden into worse situations than this and come out the other side just fine. Jacob Merritt stood at the gate of his property and studied her the way a man studies weather. He was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and still was, in the way that weathered oak is handsome. There were lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a jaw that had not softened with the years, and hands that had known hard work every single day of his adult life. He was not a man who showed much of what he felt, and what he felt right now was something close to reluctant necessity. "Miss Sutton," he said, and his voice was low and even, the way a man speaks when he has learned that most things do not deserve the energy of a raised tone. "Mr. Merritt," she replied, and she climbed down from the horse without waiting for assistance, which he noticed. His 3 sons stood in a row behind him like fence posts, and she looked at each of them in turn. The eldest was Cole, who was 22, with his father's jaw and his mother's suspicious eyes. The middle boy was Hank, 19, rangy and restless, and wearing a scowl that he had clearly been practicing. And the youngest was Eli, who had just turned 18 and had not yet decided whether to be angry or simply miserable, and seemed to be splitting the difference. Cole spoke first, because Cole always spoke first. "We don't need a housekeeper," he said, not to his father but directly to Myrtle, as though his father were not standing 2 feet away. "We've been managing just fine." Myrtle looked around the property. The porch railing was listing badly to the left. The kitchen window had a crack running through it that had been stuffed with a rag. There was a shirt hanging from the fence post that appeared to have been there through at least one rainstorm. She looked back at Cole and did not say a single word about any of it. "I'm sure you have," she said pleasantly. Hank crossed his arms. "She's just going to try to change everything," he said to Cole, as though Myrtle were not capable of hearing him from 4 feet away. Myrtle turned to Jacob. "If you'd show me to the house, Mr. Merritt, I'll have supper started before dark." Jacob looked at his sons. He looked at Myrtle. He looked at the listing porch rail and the shirt on the fence post, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a door shifts when the wind changes direction but does not yet open. "Boys," he said quietly, "take her horse to the barn." None of them moved for a moment. Then Cole made a small, disgusted sound, and Hank kicked at a clod of dirt, and Eli, because he was the youngest and had not yet hardened into outright defiance, took hold of the horse's bridle and led it away without meeting Myrtle's eyes. That night, Myrtle cooked a venison stew with dried beans and corn bread, and the 4 Merritt men sat at the table and ate it in almost complete silence. It was the best meal any of them had eaten in roughly 4 years, though none of them said so. Cole ate quickly and left the table without a word. Hank ate with his elbows on the table and his eyes on his bowl. Eli ate 2 helpings when he thought no one was watching, which Myrtle saw and noted. Jacob watched her from the end of the table as she moved around the kitchen putting things to rights, and he had the strange sensation of watching something familiar that he had given up expecting to ever see again. He cleared his throat. "It's a satisfactory meal," he said. Myrtle looked at him over her shoulder. There was a faint amusement in her expression that she kept mostly contained. "Thank you, Mr. Merritt," she said. She was 34 years old. She had been a school teacher in Virginia for 9 years, and before that she had grown up on a working farm, and she had been briefly married to a man named Thomas Sutton, who had died of typhoid fever in 1874, 3 years before she had answered the advertisement. She did not talk about any of this unless asked, and no one asked that first night. She simply worked, quietly and efficiently, until the kitchen was in order, and then she said good night and went to the small room off the back of the house that Jacob had prepared for her. Cole knocked on his father's study door that night around 9 o'clock. "You need to send her away," he said. Jacob was sitting at his desk going over the livestock ledger, and he set down his pencil and looked at his son with the patient weariness of a man who has heard many things he did not ask to hear. "She just arrived today, Cole. I know when she arrived. I'm telling you she doesn't belong here. This is our family's house. It was Mama's house." Cole's voice had gone rough on the last word, the way young men's voices go rough when they are trying hard not to feel something. "We don't need some stranger coming in here acting like she owns the place. She cooked supper and washed the dishes," Jacob said. "She hasn't claimed any territory. Not yet." Jacob looked at his son for a long moment. Cole had a leaner's eyes, that particular dark blue that went nearly gray in certain light, and right now those eyes were burning with the kind of grief that masks itself as anger because anger is so much easier to carry. "Go to bed," Jacob said gently. "Give it some time." Cole left without closing the door behind him, which was as close as he ever came to slamming it, and Jacob sat for a long time in the quiet, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, and thinking about nothing in particular in the way that men who think too much sometimes choose to think about nothing at all. The next morning, Myrtle was up before anyone else. Jacob came down to find the stove already hot and coffee already made, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with that same unsettled expression, like a man who had forgotten what it looked like when someone else cared for his house. "You didn't need to be up so early," he said. "I was always an early riser," she said. "Sit down, I'll have eggs done shortly." He sat. He drank his coffee. Myrtle worked without hurrying and without the nervous energy of someone trying to impress, and that, more than anything, was what he noticed. She was not performing helpfulness. She was simply being helpful, the same way the sun is simply warm. Eli was the next one down, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw Myrtle at the stove and then tried to look as though he had not been hoping to see her there. "Morning," he said, aiming the words somewhere between her and his father. "Good morning, Eli," Myrtle said. "Eggs." He sat down. Jacob watched his youngest son accept a plate of food from this woman he had announced he did not want, and saw the way Eli looked at the eggs and the biscuit and the small pot of jam she set beside it, and saw how his expression did the complicated thing of wanting something and resisting wanting it at the same time. "Thank you," Eli said quietly. And Myrtle simply said, "Of course," and turned back to the stove, and Jacob watched that exchange and filed it away somewhere in the back of his mind. That week was a careful negotiation of territories. Cole made a point of being absent from the house during meals as much as he could manage. Hank was present but performatively indifferent, responding to everything Myrtle said or offered with monosyllables or shrugs. Eli was thawing the fastest, though he was trying not to show it. On the fourth day, Myrtle found the old vegetable garden behind the house. It had not been tended in years. There was nothing in it but weeds and a couple of volunteer tomato plants that had struggled up through the neglect with remarkable stubbornness. She stood looking at it for a long time, and then she went to the barn and found a hoe and a trowel, and she began clearing it. Jacob saw her from the corral where he was working with a young horse, and he watched her work for several minutes without meaning to. She pulled weeds with the focused efficiency of someone who had done it many times before, and she talked to herself while she did it, too quietly for him to hear the words, but he could see her lips moving. "She's fixing up Mama's garden," Eli said quietly from somewhere behind him, Jacob had not heard him come up. He turned to find his youngest standing at the fence, watching Myrtle the same way Jacob had been watching her. "Your mother liked that garden," Jacob said. "Mama grew tomatoes and snap beans and sunflowers," Eli said. "She had sunflowers all along the back fence. Do you remember that?" "I remember," Jacob said. Eli was quiet for a moment. "Maybe she could plant sunflowers again," he said, in a tone that was trying very hard to sound like it didn't matter. Jacob did not say anything. He turned back to the horse and went on with his work, but the comment settled somewhere in his chest and stayed there. That evening, when Myrtle came to supper with dirt under her fingernails and a small scratch on her forearm from the brambles, Jacob noticed and handed her the tin of salve from the shelf by the door without saying anything, and she looked at him for a beat, something quiet passing between them before she accepted it. "The garden has good soil," she said, applying the salve to her scratch. "It should come back well with some attention. It was my wife's," he said. "She kept it up every year." "I know," Myrtle said. "The boys told me." He looked at her. "Eli told you." "He came and helped me pull weeds this afternoon," she said, without making a particular thing of it. "He talked a little while we worked. He said she grew snap beans and sunflowers." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "She did," he said, "every summer." Myrtle dried her hands on the kitchen cloth. "I ordered some seeds from the general store in Careville. They should come in next week." She paused. "Sunflower seeds included." Jacob looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to categorize. "That was thoughtful," he said. Myrtle turned to the pot on the stove and said nothing more. That night, Cole came to his father's study again, and this time Hank was with him. "She's trying to replace Mama," Cole said. "She's planting her garden, she's rearranging the kitchen. She moved Mama's blue pitcher from the windowsill." Jacob sat back in his chair. "She moved it to a higher shelf so it wouldn't get knocked off when she's working." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Cole?" "The point is she doesn't belong here." Cole's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Hank put a hand on his brother's shoulder, and something in that gesture, the way Hank's hand tightened, the way Cole's jaw went hard, broke Jacob's heart a little quietly, the way things break inside you that you don't show. "I hear you," Jacob said. "Both of you. I understand." He paused. "She is not here to replace your mother. No one could do that. She is here because this house needs tending, and so do the three of you, whether you'll admit it or not." He looked at them both steadily. "Give her a fair chance, that's all I ask." Hank crossed his arms but said nothing. Cole looked at the floor for a moment and then said, 2 weeks. We'll give it 2 weeks and then we're going to talk about this again." He said it like a man who thinks he is making a concession but is actually issuing a challenge. And Jacob recognized the tone because it was his own tone coming back to him from 20 years ago. 2 weeks, Jacob agreed. The second week brought its first real crisis in the form of a steer that had gotten through the fence and was standing in the middle of the road into town, refusing to move. And Myrtle was the one who happened to be returning from Careville in the wagon when she encountered it. She sat there for a moment considering the steer, and then she climbed down from the wagon and retrieved a rope from the back. And she roped that steer with the calm competence of someone who had grown up on a farm in Virginia where cattle were not entirely unknown. And she led it back through the gap in the fence, and rigged the fence closed with 2 of the extra fence posts she happened to have in the wagon, because she had noticed the fence was in poor condition on her way to town that morning. Hank saw her coming back with the wagon from the high pasture and rode down to meet her, and when she explained where she had been and showed him the roped gap she'd closed, he stared at her for a long and genuinely uncertain moment. "You roped him yourself," he said. "He wasn't difficult about it," she said fairly. "He seemed tired of standing in the road." Hank looked at the fence, looked at her, looked back at the fence. "That's a proper half-hitch," he said, almost accusatory. "My father ran a farm," she said simply. "I grew up knowing how to work." Hank did not say anything gracious. But that evening at supper, he told Cole about the steer and the fence in a low voice while they thought she couldn't hear, and Myrtle, stirring the pot at the stove, permitted herself a very small, private smile. The 2 weeks ended and Cole came to his father's study as promised, and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and Jacob looked up from his ledger. "Well," Jacob said. Cole was quiet for a beat. "She's capable," he said finally, with an expression like the words tasted of something unexpected. "That's all," Jacob said. "That's all I'm saying right now," Cole said. He paused. "She hasn't moved any more of Mama's things." "She put the blue pitcher back on the windowsill," Jacob said. Cole blinked. "When?" "3 days ago, after she washed it." Cole said nothing for a moment. Then he turned and went back down the hall, and Jacob listened to his footsteps on the wooden floor and thought that was progress, even if it looked like a man walking away. By the 3rd week, Myrtle had fallen into the rhythm of the ranch the way water falls into the shape of its riverbed, naturally and without force. She knew which horse was which, and how each of them liked to be approached. She knew that Eli drank 2 cups of coffee in the morning and felt better for them. She knew that Hank had a sweet tooth he was embarrassed about, and she baked a honey cake on Fridays that appeared on the table like it had always been there. She knew that Cole took the rough edge off a bad day by sitting on the north fence at dusk and watching the sun go down, and she made a point of never encroaching on that solitude. And Jacob, she was learning Jacob the way you learn a landscape, slowly and in pieces, and with the growing awareness that there is always more depth than first appears. He worked harder than anyone on the property, harder even than the 2 ranch hands he employed, a quiet Tejano man named Francisco and a lanky young cowboy from Missouri named Davis who wore his hat at an angle that suggested he had strong opinions about it. Jacob was up before the sun and asleep long after dark, and in between those 2 facts was a life entirely composed of responsibility. He carried it without complaint and without drama, and Myrtle recognized that quality because she had once carried her own burdens the same way. There were moments, brief ones, when she caught him watching her. Not in a manner that was inappropriate, but in the manner of a man who is puzzling something out and is not sure yet what conclusion he is moving toward. He would be looking at her from across the room, and when she looked back, he would return his eyes to whatever he had been doing, unhurried, as though he had simply been resting his gaze and she had happened to be in the way. She thought about him more than she should have, and she was honest with herself about that. She was a practical woman, and she recognized the direction her feelings were moving, and she also recognized that this was neither the time nor the circumstance for such feelings, and she kept them very neatly contained in the way you keep something alive that you're not yet sure you have a right to keep. The first real conversation she had with Cole happened in the 5th week, and it began, unexpectedly, over a horse. Cole had a 3-year-old mare he was trying to break to saddle, and the mare was having none of it. Myrtle came out to the corral one evening to watch, because she liked horses and because the day's work was done and the evening was cool, and there was a particular quality to the late spring light in the hill country that made being inside feel like a waste. Cole was working the mare in circles, patient and firm, and Myrtle leaned on the fence rail and watched without comment. After a while Cole said, without looking at her, "You're going to tell me I'm doing it wrong." "I wasn't planning to," Myrtle said. Silence. The mare circled. Cole worked the line. "You have an opinion, though," he said. Myrtle looked at the mare for a moment. "She's not fighting the saddle," she said. "She's fighting the bit. She doesn't like the pressure on the bars of her mouth. If you let her get used to a hackamore first, she might come along faster." Cole turned the mare in the other direction. He was quiet for a while. "How do you know about horse breaking?" "I don't much," Myrtle said honestly. "But I watched a man work horses in a similar way once, a Cherokee man from Tennessee who came through our county when I was young. He said horses respond to trust the same way people do. You can force it, but it doesn't hold." Cole looked at her then, for what was probably the first real straight-faced look he had given her since she arrived. "You grew up in Virginia," he said. "Near Roanoke. My father grew corn and kept a small herd of beef cattle. My mother grew a garden and worried too much." She said the last part gently with a small smile. "She was good at both." Cole was quiet again. Then carefully, like a man feeling his way across uncertain ground, "My mother grew snap beans and sunflowers." Eli told me, Myrtle said. She sounds like she was a lovely woman. Cole turned his face away and worked the mare in another circle. When he spoke again, his voice was measured in the way men's voices are when they are measuring them deliberately. She was the best person I ever knew, he said. She used to sing when she hung the washing out. I don't know why I remember that particular thing out of everything. He paused. She had a terrible singing voice, actually, completely off-key, but she sang anyway and never seemed to notice. Myrtle did not offer comfort because she understood that comfort was not what this was about. This was a young man finally finding a place where he could put down something heavy for a moment, and the right response was simply to be present while he did it. She sounds like she was wonderful, Myrtle said. Cole nodded once, still not looking at her, and went back to working the mare. But the next morning he came to breakfast without the expression of a man attending his own execution, and he said good morning before he sat down, which Myrtle accepted as the significant event it was. Hank's turn came differently. Hank was a young man who expressed himself through his hands rather than his words. He was always fixing things, taking things apart, understanding how things worked from the inside out. He had turned the old smoke house into a sort of workshop, and he spent his free hours in there with tools and wood and wire, building and repairing and inventing small solutions to practical problems on the ranch. Myrtle needed the washing pole out back extended because the existing one was too short for the heavy winter quilts she was airing out and they kept dragging in the dirt. She had tried to figure out how to extend it herself and had reached the limits of her carpentry ability. She went to the workshop and knocked on the open door. Hank looked up from the vise he was working at. "The washing pole," she said. "I need it to be about 2 feet taller. Would you be willing to help me with it?" He looked at her, and she watched him decide whether to be helpful or difficult, and she waited without pressure while he made that decision. "What kind of joint are you thinking?" he said finally. Myrtle blinked. "I honestly don't know, something that would hold weight. The wet quilts are heavy." Hank set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag and came to look at the washing pole. He studied it for a few minutes, tilting his head, and Myrtle stayed back and let him think. "Mortise and tenon joint," he said, "with a dowel pin to lock it. It'll hold anything you put on it." He paused. "I can have it done before supper." "Thank you, Hank," she said. He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude the way young men often are. "It's just a pole," he said. But it was done before supper, and it was done excellently, with a clean joint and a smooth pin and an extra notch at the top where the line could loop without slipping, which she had not asked for but which was exactly what she had been wishing for. She looked at it and then looked at him, and he was watching from the workshop door with his arms crossed, pretending not to care what she thought. "It's perfect," she said. "Better than what I imagined." He said and turned to go back inside, but she caught the slight shift of his expression that might, on another face, have been pleasure. After that, Hank started leaving things for her. Not conspicuously, not with any announcement. But a cracked board on the kitchen step was suddenly repaired. The kitchen window's cracked pane was replaced with a new piece of glass. The listing porch rail was straightened and reinforced. Each repair happened quietly, without explanation, and Myrtle accepted each of them the same way, with the same quiet acknowledgement, without making more of them than they were. Jacob noticed all of this. He could not have said when he began paying such careful attention to Myrtle Sutton, except that he had the feeling it had been happening gradually, the way daylight grows, without a clear beginning, just a steady brightening. He noticed the way she spoke to people, honestly but with a gentleness that was not weakness. He noticed how she never competed for space in a room. He noticed her laugh, which he had first heard when Davis, the ranch hand, told a long and meandering story about a mule that had gotten into a hardware store in Missouri and eaten 3 pounds of nails, and Myrtle had laughed with her whole face, and the sound of it had gone through Jacob's chest like the first warm day after a cold winter. He did not examine this feeling closely, because he was a man who had learned that some things bear more weight when examined less. But it was there, and it grew, quietly and steadily, the way the most substantial things grow. In June, there was trouble. The kind of trouble the hill country was not unfamiliar with in 1878. A band of rustlers working through the county, cutting fences and moving cattle, and 3 ranches in the area had already reported losses. Jacob organized his ranch hands and his sons into a watch rotation, and the evenings grew tense and the nights were long. Myrtle did not involve herself in the ranch's defensive strategies. That was not her place, and she knew it. But she kept the coffee hot through all hours of the night, and she quietly packed provisions for the men who rode out to check the fence lines. And she sat with her lamp burning low in the kitchen during the longer waiting times because a lit window was something, even when there was nothing else to offer. It was on one of these nights that Jacob came in well after midnight, cold and tired from a long ride checking the south fence, and found Myrtle at the kitchen table with her lamp and a book, and a pot of coffee still on the warm stove. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked up. "Any trouble?" she asked. "Not tonight," he said. He pulled off his coat and hung it on the hook and came to the table, and she poured him coffee without being asked. He sat down across from her and wrapped his hands around the cup, and they sat in a silence that was entirely different from the careful silences of the early weeks. This was the silence of 2 people who have become comfortable enough with each other to simply be quiet without filling the air. "You didn't have to wait up," he said. "I wasn't waiting for any particular reason," she said. "I couldn't sleep." He looked at the book on the table. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, well worn. "Is it any good?" "Very. Have you read him?" "Parts of things," Jacob said. "I don't get much time for reading." "I know," she said. She paused. "You work too hard, Mr. Merritt." He looked at her. "The ranch doesn't run itself." "No," she agreed. "But a man who never stops can't see clearly. You need quiet as much as any of this." She gestured vaguely at the ranch beyond the walls. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You sound like a leaner." The name fell gently into the space between them and sat there, and Myrtle met his eyes and held them. "Is that all right?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said finally. "It's all right." They sat for another hour, and they talked, actually talked, in the way 2 people talk when the walls are down and the hour is late and there is no one to observe or perform for. She told him about Virginia and her parents and Thomas and the years of teaching school, and she did not soften any of it or dress it up. He told her about building the ranch from 160 acres to nearly 800, and about a leaner, and about the years since her death, the way time had both slowed and blurred. "Cole was the hardest hit," Jacob said. "He was 18 when she died. Old enough to understand exactly what was lost, young enough to not know what to do with it." "He loved her completely," Myrtle said. "They all did, so did I." He looked into his coffee cup. "I still do." "Of course you do," Myrtle said. "That doesn't change, it just makes room eventually." Jacob looked at her with that studying expression she was coming to know well, the one where he was working something out, and he said nothing. But something in him shifted visibly, the way a door opens a few degrees more. He went to bed around 2 in the morning, and Myrtle sat for a while longer with her Emerson and her lamp, and she admitted to herself, in the privacy of the late hour, that she was in considerable trouble. She had not come here looking for love. She had come here looking for work and for purpose, and for a way to make herself useful in the world, because those were things she knew how to find. Love was something else entirely, and it arrived without invitation at the most inconvenient times, and it arrived now in the form of a quiet, weathered rancher who sat across from her in the middle of the night, and spoke honestly about grief and loss, and she thought she had never in her life found plain honesty so entirely arresting. She pressed her feelings down firmly and went to bed. The rustler trouble came to a head 2 weeks later. A band of 4 men was caught cutting the Merritt fence on the far east pasture in the middle of the night by Jacob and Cole, and while the resulting confrontation involved more raised voices than actual violence, one of the rustlers fired a shot that grazed Cole's arm, and Cole came home with his shirt sleeve bloody. Myrtle was up within minutes of them coming through the door, and she had Cole seated at the kitchen table before he fully registered what was happening, and she cleaned and bound the wound with the calm efficiency of a woman who had helped with farm injuries since she was 12 years old, and Cole sat very still under her hands and did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "It's not bad." "No," she agreed. "It looks worse than it is. The ball didn't lodge." She tied off the bandage neatly. "You'll be sore for a week." Cole was quiet for another beat. Then very quietly, "Thank you." Myrtle looked at him, and the expression on his face was not the expression she had come to expect from him, the guarded, faintly hostile expression of a young man defending something precious. It was something more open. Something that recognized her, perhaps for the first time, simply as a person who cared about what happened to him. "You're welcome," she said. Jacob stood in the kitchen doorway the whole time and watched Myrtle take care of his son, and what happened in his chest then was not subtle. It was not a question he needed to work out or a door shifting by degrees. It was something clear and solid and unmistakable, and it took him completely off guard in the way that things only surprise you when you have been not looking at them directly for too long. He went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a very long time, staring at the ceiling, turning the feeling over, examining it. He thought about Alina. He thought about what it would mean to love someone again, and whether it was possible, and whether it would be a betrayal. And then he thought about what Alina would say to him if she were sitting in the chair by the window the way she used to. And he thought she would probably tell him, with the warm exasperation that had been so completely her, that being happy was not a dishonor to the dead, and that he had been serious long enough. He almost smiled at that thought. Then he lay there a while longer, thinking about Myrtle Sutton, and he let himself think about her without reservation for the first time, which was like finally putting down something he had been holding at a careful distance. He thought about her competence and her honesty, and the way she moved through his house as though she belonged there without ever claiming to. He thought about her laugh and her patience with his sons, and the fact that she had been up every night during the Rustler trouble with coffee hot on the stove. He thought about the way she had said, "I still do," and you loved her completely, and those aren't replacements. And he thought about how she had never once tried to be Alina, and in so doing had become someone entirely, irreplaceably herself. He slept eventually, and his sleep was quieter than it had been in some time. The seeds Myrtle had ordered from Kerrville arrived, and she and Eli planted the garden on a warm Saturday morning in late June. They worked side by side in the neat rows Myrtle had prepared, and Eli talked while they worked, which was a thing he was doing more and more, talking with her the way you talk with someone you have come to trust without fully deciding to. He talked about his plans for after the ranch. He wanted to study engineering. There was a school in Austin that offered a course in civil engineering, and he had been reading what he could about it for 2 years, saving what little money he earned, trying to figure out whether it was possible or just a dream. "It's absolutely possible," Myrtle said, pressing a sunflower seed into the soil. "Your mind is made for it. I've watched you solve problems. You think structurally." Eli looked at her with the intense seriousness that was his particular quality. "You think so?" "I do," she said firmly. "Have you told your father?" Eli was quiet for a moment. "Not really. I tried to bring it up once and I'm not sure he heard me. There's always so much going on here." Myrtle thought about this. "Tell him properly," she said. "Sit him down and tell him clearly what you want. He listens better than you think." Eli pressed another seed into the ground. "You've got to know him pretty well," he said, without any particular agenda in the statement, just an observation. Myrtle kept her eyes on the garden row. "He's a clear person once you understand the way he communicates." Eli was quiet for a beat and then said, "He smiles more lately. Since you came." He said it simply as a fact, the way you note a change in weather. Myrtle did not respond to that directly. She moved to the next row and began planting beans, and the morning went on around them, warm and busy and good. That Sunday, after the week's work was done, Jacob found Myrtle on the front porch in the evening, sitting in the chair that had been there since he built the house, looking out at the rolling cedar hills that went golden at this hour. He came and leaned against the porch rail which Hank had repaired and which was now perfectly solid, and looked out at the same view. "Eli spoke to me this morning," he said, "about the engineering school." Myrtle kept her eyes on the hills. "Did he? You encouraged him." "I said what I thought." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "You were right to. I should have listened better when he brought it up before." He paused. "I told him I'd look into what the school costs and what help we might arrange." Myrtle glanced at him then. "He'll be glad to hear it." Jacob turned slightly so he was half facing her, and the last light of the day was falling across his face in the way it had of making the most angular faces look briefly soft. "Miss Sutton," he said. "Myrtle." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it land. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something, and I'm going to ask that you hear me through before you respond, because I am not a man who does this easily." She set her hands in her lap and looked at him fully. "I'm listening." He was quiet for a moment, gathering himself, and she could see him doing it, the careful assembly of words by a man who measures them. "When you came here," he said, "I thought your presence would be a practical arrangement, something necessary but essentially impersonal." He looked at his hands on the rail. "I did not expect anything beyond that. I was not looking for anything beyond that." He paused. "But you have been here 3 months now, and in that time you have done more for this family than I could have anticipated. Not only the practical things, though those have been considerable, but the other things. The harder things." He looked at her. "You gave my sons back something they had closed themselves off from. You sat with Cole until he could speak about his mother without it breaking him. You showed Hank that someone could appreciate what he made. You told Eli that his ambitions were worth taking seriously." He stopped. "And you have been patient with me and my stubbornness in a way I have not deserved." Myrtle was very still. "What I'm trying to say," Jacob continued, "is that I find myself in a position I did not plan for. I have come to care for you in a way that goes considerably beyond what any practical arrangement requires." He met her eyes steadily. "I am not a man who speaks lightly. I would not say this if I did not mean it entirely." The evening light was turning to dusk, and the first stars were becoming visible above the cedar line, and somewhere in the pasture a mockingbird was going through its repertoire. And Myrtle sat in the gathering dark with her hands in her lap and her heart doing something it had not done in a very long time. "Jacob," she said, and his name, which she had been careful not to use, came out with a warmth she had not planned. "You don't have to say anything tonight," he said quickly. "I don't want to put you in a difficult position. I only wanted to be honest because I think you deserve honesty, whatever you choose to do with it." She stood up. She was nearly as tall as his shoulder, and she turned to face him fully in the warm dusk, and she said, "I came to Texas with nothing but my carpetbag and a letter and the general intention of being useful somewhere, and I did not expect anything more than that either." She paused. "But I have been honestly and hopelessly fond of you for at least the past 6 weeks, and I've been firmly telling myself it wasn't sensible, and I'm beginning to think sensible is somewhat overrated." Jacob looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression came open in a way she had not seen before, a genuine, unguarded look that did not calculate or measure or hold anything back, and she thought she had never seen him look quite like himself until this exact moment. "Is that so?" he said. "That is very much so," she said. He reached out and took her hand from where it rested at her side, and he held it carefully, as though it were something he had been given and intended to keep. And they stood on the porch in the dusk with the mockingbird going on, and the stars coming out above the cedar hills, and neither of them needed to say anything more right then. Cole saw them from the barn doorway as he was coming in from the evening chores. He stopped and looked, and he stood there for a long moment, and then he turned and went back into the barn, and he stood in the dark between the stalls, and he pressed his hands flat against one of the rough posts, and he let himself feel all of the complicated things at once, the grief and the protectiveness and the loyalty to his mother's memory. And he let them move through him, and they moved through him, and what was on the other side of them was not quite what he expected. What was on the other side was something that looked, cautiously and tentatively, like relief. Because his father had been so careful and so contained for so long, because the house had been so quiet for so long, because the years without warmth in it had been so long, and his father had carried it all without complaint, and somewhere in Cole's chest, beneath the grief, was the part of him that loved his father and had been watching with some helpless ache as his father grew harder and quieter and more alone. He stood in the dark for a while, and then he went to do the rest of the evening chores, and he did not speak of what he had seen. But the next morning at breakfast, he sat down and said, "These eggs are good." And he said it to Myrtle, plainly and without architecture, just a thing said to a person at a table. And Jacob looked at his eldest son, and Myrtle caught Jacob's eye over Cole's head, and they shared something there, brief and wordless and immeasurable. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of happiness that is quiet and unhurried, and therefore more durable than the loud kind. Jacob and Myrtle did not make a production of what had changed between them. They were appropriate and measured in the presence of others, because this was 1878 and there were things that decorum required. And besides, both of them were the type of people who kept their most precious things close and private. But there were small changes that were visible to anyone who looked. Jacob came home from the back pasture at midday sometimes, which he had never done before, just to eat lunch in the kitchen. He started reading in the evenings instead of going straight from dinner to his ledgers, and Myrtle read across from him at the table, and they would occasionally read a passage aloud to each other that they thought the other should hear. He asked her opinion on ranch things, not just household things, and he listened to the answers with the serious attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. And she began to know his face so well that she could read his mood from 20 feet away. She knew when the cattleman's negotiations were going badly by the set of his jaw at breakfast. She knew when something had gone well in the pasture by the slight looseness in his shoulders as he came home. She knew his silences the way she knew the different kinds of quiet, the companionable kind and the burdened kind and the thinking kind, and she moved around them accordingly, which was something he had not had in 4 years, and which he appreciated in a way that was beyond words. In July, Davis, the Missouri cowboy, came to the house one evening, hat in hand and slightly flushed, and asked Jacob very formally if it would be acceptable if he courted the daughter of the family who ran the dry goods store in Careville. Jacob told him it was none of his business, but his blessing was freely given, and Davis beamed and went away, and Myrtle watched from the kitchen window and laughed. Francisco, the Tejano ranch hand, who was a man of quiet dignity and few words, had by this time accepted Myrtle in the way that Francisco accepted most things, without ceremony and without any apparent difficulty. He sometimes brought her wildflowers from the meadow near the creek with the straightforward simplicity of a man who did such things without calculating their meaning, and she put them in the blue pitcher on the windowsill, and they made the kitchen better. In August, the sunflowers bloomed. Myrtle came out one morning and found them open along the back fence of the garden, tall and golden, and turning their faces east toward the rising sun, and she stood and looked at them for a long time, and Eli came up beside her without speaking, and they stood together looking at the sunflowers that hadn't been there for 4 years. Cole came out to look, and then Hank, and then Jacob, and the 5 of them stood in the garden in the early morning with the sun coming up and the sunflowers gold against the sky, and no one said anything for a while. Then Cole said very quietly she'd have liked them. "Yes," Jacob said. His voice was steady and warm. "She would have." Myrtle reached over and touched Cole's arm briefly, just the lightest pressure of her hand, the kind of touch that says "I know and I'm here" without requiring an answer, and Cole looked down at her hand and then looked away at the sunflowers, and he did not pull back. That evening, Jacob proposed. He did not do it elaborately. He was not a man given to elaborate gestures, and Myrtle would not have wanted them. He came to find her after supper when the boys had gone about their separate evenings, and she was in the garden with a lamp checking on the bean plants, because the beans were nearing harvest, and she wanted to see how close. He came and stood at the edge of the garden and said her name, and she looked up. He said, "I've been thinking about what I want and about whether it's right to ask for it, and I've decided that a man who thinks too long about whether he deserves a good thing generally ends up without it." He paused. "I would very much like to marry you, Myrtle, if you're willing." She set down her lamp on the nearest fence post. "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard," she said, and her voice was entirely warm. He almost laughed. "I know, I should have thought of something better." "No," she said, walking toward him through the bean rows. "It was absolutely perfect." She came to a stop in front of him, and she looked up at him in the lamplight, and she said, "Yes, I'm willing." He took her face in both his hands carefully, the way a man holds something that matters enormously, and he kissed her, and she felt 4 years of careful containment in that kiss, and her own years of the same, and the extraordinary relief of letting go of both. When they went inside and told the boys, the responses were, predictably, varied. Eli said good, with a decisiveness that suggested he had been expecting this and approving of it for some time. Hank said, "About time," and then looked as though he had surprised himself, and then shrugged and went back to the workshop. Cole was the last one Jacob told. He found him on the north fence at dusk, which was his place, and sat beside him and told him directly, without preamble, the way he always told Cole things. Cole was quiet for a long time. The sun was going down over the Cedar Hills, and the sky was turning the colors that happen at sundown in Texas in August, pink and gold and a deep burning orange at the horizon. "She's not Mama," Cole said finally. "No," Jacob said. "She's not. And she was never trying to be." Cole looked down at his hands. "I know that," he said. "I know it now." He was quiet again for a moment. "She's good to you. She's good to all of us." He said it carefully, like each word had been weighed. "I think Mama would have liked her." Jacob felt something release in his chest that he had not known he was holding. "I think she would have," he said. Cole nodded once, and that was enough. He sat a while longer on the fence in the sunset, and Jacob sat with him, and after a while Cole said, "I'm not going to be strange about it. I want you to know that. I might have been strange about it at the start, but I'm not going to be strange about it." "I know," Jacob said. "I'm glad you're not alone," Cole said, and his voice was rough on the last word again, but this time it was not grief that roughened it. It was something more like love, the kind that knows it's not conditional. They were married in September in the small church in Careville, a quiet ceremony with the boys present and Francisco and Davis, and the woman who ran the general store and her husband and the minister's wife, who cried regardless of whether she knew the people involved. Myrtle wore a dress of deep blue wool, the best she owned, which she had altered and pressed until it was presentable, and she carried flowers from her own garden, the last of the summer blooms, including sunflowers because she could not leave them out. Jacob stood at the altar and watched her walk down the aisle on her own because she had no one to give her away, and she had said she preferred it that way. She had been her own person for a long time, and she would continue to be. And he thought she was the most clearly herself person he had ever met, and he thought he would spend the rest of his life learning the full extent of who she was, and he was entirely grateful for that prospect. They said their vows simply and meant every word of them, and the minister pronounced them married, and Jacob kissed his wife with considerably more enthusiasm than the church setting strictly required, which made Eli laugh and Davis put his fingers in his mouth and whistle, and Cole, in the front pew, smile the full, uncomplicated smile that his father had not seen since his mother was alive. The first year of their marriage was busy and full, and they were happy in the working, practical way of people whose happiness is built into the fabric of the daily life they share, rather than reserved for exceptional moments. Myrtle ran the house and the garden and involved herself increasingly in the accounts, because she had a clear head for numbers and Jacob was glad to have the help. They fought occasionally. Both of them were too honest and too straightforward to avoid it, but they fought cleanly and they resolved things quickly, and neither of them was the type to hold grievances past their usefulness. In December, they had a Christmas that was the first real one the Merritt house had had in 4 years. Myrtle decorated with cedar boughs and pine cones and a simple wreath on the door, and she cooked for 2 days. And on Christmas Eve, the boys were all at the table and Davis and Francisco were invited to share the meal. And there were candles lit, and the house smelled of cedar and cinnamon and roasting meat, and it looked like itself again, fully and properly. Jacob looked at his family around the table, all 5 of his sons and hands, and Myrtle at the other end. And something in him that had been held in careful restraint for 4 years finally settled into rest. He caught Myrtle's eye from across the table, and she looked back at him, and in that look was everything neither of them needed to say, that this was what they had built and it was good. Cole lifted his glass and said, "To the family," and everyone lifted theirs, and the candles burned warm, and the night was cold and clear outside, and inside there was light. In the spring, Myrtle was expecting. She told Jacob one morning in the garden quietly, while they were checking on the first shoots coming up through the soil. She watched his face closely as she told him, knowing there would be layers to whatever he felt, because there always were. He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand very carefully, his thumb moving across her knuckles, and he said, "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "Good," he said. "That's the important thing." But his face had gone gentle in a way she had not quite seen before, and she saw in it not only the present joy but the memory of the other times he had stood on this same ground with this same news, the shadow of a leaner and of loss and of years of carrying things carefully. She understood what it cost him to hope again, and she held his hand and let him feel whatever he needed to feel. That evening he told the boys. Eli grinned and said this was excellent news. Hank said, "Is that right?" and then nodded slowly, and there was a warmth in it. Cole sat very still for a moment, and then he looked at his father and said, "I hope it's a boy," and Jacob laughed, actually laughed, freely and with his whole face, and Cole's expression at hearing that sound was something that went too deep for words. The baby came in October the following year, and it was a boy. They named him Samuel. He came into the world in the room off the back of the house, which had once been Myrtle's room when she first arrived, and which had been turned into a proper bedroom for them. And he was loud and vigorous and perfectly healthy. And Jacob held him in the kitchen afterward with an expression of such transparent wonder that Myrtle, propped on pillows watching him from the doorway where the midwife had seated her, felt a full and complete happiness she had nearly stopped believing was available to her. Cole held the baby first among the brothers. He held him with the careful, solemn attention of a man handling something irreplaceable, and he looked down at the small face and said, very softly, "Hello, Samuel." Samuel looked back at him with the unfocused, serious attention of the very newborn, and grabbed Cole's finger with a grip that was, for something that small, surprisingly determined. Cole did not move for a long time. Hank held him next and was immediately completely disarmed, all his careful composure gone in about 30 seconds, replaced by the besotted expression of a young man who has just understood what it means to be captivated by something this small and this defenseless. And he said, "He's going to need to learn how things work," with great seriousness, and Myrtle said, "I'm sure he will have an excellent teacher," and Hank looked at her with the open, uncomplicated warmth that had been growing between them for a year, and smiled. Eli held him last and promptly told the baby about the principles of civil engineering, which were going to be very important for him to understand early. He had indeed written to the school in Austin, and Jacob had indeed made arrangements, and Eli was going to Austin in January, and he was lit with a quiet excitement that Myrtle had been watching grow for months with deep satisfaction. On the night after Samuel was born, after the midwife had gone and the boys had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Jacob came and sat beside Myrtle, and she leaned against him, tired but entirely at peace, and they sat together in the lamplight listening to Samuel breathe in the small cradle that Hank had spent 3 weeks making, with dovetail joints and a smooth carved rocker, and a small sunflower carved into the headboard because Hank had said, very quietly, without any drama, that he thought it was appropriate. "Are you happy?" Jacob asked. It was a question he had asked once before, about 3 months after they were married, and she had answered it with everything that was true at the time. Now she answered it again with everything that was true now, which was more. "Profoundly," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head and held her carefully, in the way he held everything that mattered to him, with a steadiness that was so entirely his, and they listened to their son breathe. And outside the window the hill country lay under a million stars, cold and wild and beautiful, and the cedar hills were dark against the sky, and a coyote called somewhere far away, and the ranch was quiet. 2 years passed, and the ranch grew and prospered. Cole took on more responsibility. Jacob handed things off to him gradually, the way you hand things to someone you trust, and Cole grew into the role with the same careful steadiness as his father, and the ranch ran better for having 2 clear heads running it. He began spending time in Careville more frequently, and eventually Jacob asked him about it in the direct way Jacob asked things, and Cole admitted there was a young woman, a schoolteacher newly arrived from Ohio, and Jacob said, "Bring her to supper," and did not make a ceremony of it. Her name was Hannah, and she was kind and slightly nervous, and she had excellent table manners, and she clearly adored Cole, who was visibly and helplessly smitten with her in the way that very serious young men become helplessly smitten with people who make them feel understood. Myrtle liked her immediately and said so privately to Jacob that night, and Jacob said, "I thought you would," with a satisfaction that suggested he had thought this through. Cole proposed to Hannah at the end of that year, and they were married the following spring, and they set up in the foreman's house that Jacob had built on the east side of the ranch when the operation grew large enough to require it, and the Merritt ranch gained a new family within its bounds. Hank's workshop became known in Care County for its quality. He built furniture and repaired equipment, and designed a new braking system for the wagon that Davis told everyone in the county about, and gradually there was a steady business to it. He was happy in the way people are happy when their work is their genuine calling, and that was enough for now, and Myrtle trusted it would grow into more when it was ready. Eli came home from Austin the Christmas of his 2nd year, and he was different, not altered in character, but expanded, filled out. The person he had been becoming finally given the room to become it fully. He was studying hard and doing well, and he talked about his coursework with a passion that was wonderful to watch. He had also, he mentioned somewhat incidentally, met a young woman at a church social in Austin named Clara, a young woman of 20 whose father was a doctor, and who was sharp and funny, and had opinions on structural engineering that Eli was not too proud to admit he found compelling. "She sounds remarkable," Myrtle said. "She is," Eli said, with a simple directness that was very like his father. Samuel, meanwhile, grew with great enthusiasm. He was a vigorous, curious child who required constant engagement, and was deeply interested in everything from the horses to the tools in Hank's workshop, to the books in Jacob's study to the garden, where he followed Myrtle with enormous seriousness, and communicated with the bean plants in a personal and private language that apparently worked, because they grew very well. At 3 years old he called Myrtle Mama for the first time without any self-consciousness or ceremony, just said it the way you say things that have always been true, and Myrtle, who was kneeling in the garden at the time, stopped what she was doing and sat very still for a moment, and then she gathered him up and held him and said, "Yes, sweetheart, I'm right here." And the afternoon went on around them, golden and warm and good. Jacob saw this from the porch, and he sat there for a long time after they went in, watching the evening come over the cedar hills, and he thought about all of the things that had happened and all of the things that had not happened and the narrow margin between them. He thought about the morning Myrtle had ridden onto his property with her carpetbag and her quiet dignity, and he thought about his sons lined up like fence posts behind him, and he thought about everything that had come after. He thought about Cole, who had told him to send her away and who had held her on the night of the rustlers and had smiled at their wedding, and now was building his own life a quarter-mile across the property with a wife he adored. He thought about Hank, who had demanded she proved her worth, and who had quietly repaired every broken thing in her orbit, and who now built things with a sunflower carved in them because she had planted sunflowers. He thought about Eli, who had helped her pull weeds and had told her about engineering school, and who was in Austin right now becoming exactly the person he was meant to be. He thought about Alina, whom he would always love, and about the way love does not subtract but compounds, and about how he had not understood this until he was standing in a garden in the dusk with a woman who had the courage to be honest with him about being hopelessly fond of him, and he thought that Alina had known all along. In the particular way she had known things, from her chair by the window with her off-key singing, that he would find his way here. Myrtle came out onto the porch and sat in the chair beside him, and he reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the warm evening watching the light change on the hills. "Cole wants to talk about expanding the east pasture," she said. "I know," he said. "He's been circling it for a week. He's right, the cattle numbers justify it." "He is right," Jacob said. "He usually is." There was pride in his voice, uncomplicated and full. They sat together in the quiet. Somewhere in the house, Samuel was having a conversation with himself that had been going on since his bath and showed no signs of concluding. From the workshop came the occasional sound of Hank working late, the clean rhythm of a plane moving across wood. "Davis got a letter from Missouri," Myrtle said. "His mother isn't well." "I know. He told me. I told him to take whatever time he needs." "He needs the work, though. He'll have it when he comes back, he knows that." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Francisco said he'd take the extra shifts without complaint." "Francisco never complains about anything," Myrtle said. "No," Jacob agreed. "He's a better man than most." The stars came out one by one, the way they do in the hill country, very bright and very many, the sky so wide and clear it looks like a different sky from anywhere else in the world. Myrtle leaned her head against Jacob's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet together in the very best way. "I'm going to plant more sunflowers next spring," she said. "Along the full fence line," he said. "Along the full fence line," she said. "And down the path to the barn." "Alina would approve," he said. "I know she would," Myrtle said. "I feel her approval every summer." She paused. "I hope that's not strange." "It's not strange at all," he said. "It's right." They sat until Samuel called for her from inside, which he did with the full-throated conviction of someone who has never had cause to doubt he would be answered. Myrtle rose and smoothed her dress and went inside, and Jacob listened to her voice in the house, warm and unhurried, and he thought that this was exactly what a life was supposed to sound like. The following spring, Myrtle planted sunflowers along the full fence line and down the path to the barn, as promised. The entire ranch blazed golden by July, which Davis, back from Missouri, his mother recovered, declared was the finest thing he had seen in Texas, which was saying something. Eli came home for the summer with Clara, who was everything Eli had said and more, sharp-minded and warm, and clearly devoted to Eli with a quiet completeness that was good to see. She and Myrtle took to each other quickly, the way women take to each other when they recognize a kindred seriousness, and they spent a great deal of the summer in conversations that kept the porch occupied for hours at a stretch, which Eli was visibly happy about. Jacob, watching Eli and Clara in the garden one evening, looked at Myrtle standing beside him and said, "He's going to ask her to marry him." "He already has," Myrtle said. Jacob looked at her. "You knew before I did." "She told me this afternoon," Myrtle said. "She wanted to talk about it with someone." She smiled. "I told her Eli was worth every year she'd ever invest in him." Jacob shook his head slowly. "How do you do that?" he said. "How do you always know exactly what people need?" "I pay attention," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment in the early evening light, and his expression was the open, unguarded one that she had first seen on the porch the night he told her his feelings, the one that belonged entirely to her. He said, "I love you, Myrtle," with a straightforwardness that was so entirely him, no ceremony, just the plain truth laid down. "I love you, Jacob," she said the same way. He took her hand and they walked back toward the house, through the garden with its rows of late summer vegetables and its border of sunflowers standing tall in the warm air, through the yard where Samuel was chasing Francisco's dog in circles with complete dedication, past Hank's workshop where the sound of work never entirely stopped, toward the house that had once been quiet and closed, and that was now fully, irreversibly, wonderfully alive. Cole and Hannah were coming for supper. Cole had taken to showing up early to talk cattle figures with Jacob over coffee before Hannah arrived, and Jacob had taken to making sure the coffee was hot before Cole came, and this small ritual between father and son was one of the things Myrtle loved to watch. The way the two most stubborn, careful, self-contained people she had ever known had found their way to each other through the ordinary daily gestures. Myrtle went into the kitchen and started supper, and Jacob came to stand in the doorway the way he did, leaning with his shoulder against the frame, watching her work, and she looked up and caught him at it. "Stop watching me and do something useful," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. "About what?" "About whether we should put up another room before next spring." She stopped what she was doing and turned to look at him, and he met her eyes with a quiet smile that told her he already knew the answer to what he was about to say. "Because," he continued, "I think we're going to need the space." Myrtle understood what he was asking. She set down the spoon she was holding and she felt the particular knowledge of it, the thing she had been carrying carefully for 3 weeks, not yet certain, but now certain enough. "Yes," she said, "I think we probably are." Jacob came away from the doorway and crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands the same way he had in the garden when she said yes to his proposal, with that careful, entirely focused tenderness. "Are you well?" he asked, the same question he always asked first. "Very," she said. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a moment, in the kitchen that smelled of supper and cedar, in the house they had made into a home, in the life they had built together from nothing but willingness and hard work, and the particular courage it takes to let someone in. "2 children," he said quietly. "Can you imagine?" "3, if you count Samuel's friendship with Francisco's dog," she said. He laughed, and his laughter was the most honest sound she knew, and she leaned up and kissed him. And outside the window the sunflowers stood along the fence in the last of the afternoon light, tall and golden, and turning their faces toward the west now as the sun moved, all of them following the light the way living things do when they know where the warmth is, when they have found the thing that makes them grow. Samuel came running in through the back door with his boots covered in mud and Francisco's dog behind him and his face lit with the uncomplicated joy of a child who has been thoroughly and satisfyingly outside, and he skidded to a stop at the sight of his parents standing close in the kitchen. "What are you doing?" he said with 4-year-old directness. "Talking," Myrtle said. "About what?" "About adding a room onto the house," Jacob said. Samuel considered this. "Can I have the new room?" "That depends," Jacob said, crouching down to his son's level, "on whether the new room turns out to be for a brother or a sister." Samuel's eyes went very large. He looked at his mother. He looked at his father. He looked at the dog who was no help. "A brother," he said, with the authority of someone who considers this a settled matter. Jacob looked up at Myrtle over Samuel's head, and Myrtle looked back at him, and they were both trying not to laugh and failing, and the kitchen filled with it, with the laughter and the lamplight and the smell of supper on the stove, and Cole's knock at the front door a moment later, and Hannah's voice calling from the porch, and Hank coming in from the workshop with sawdust in his hair, and all of it. The complete and ordinary and extraordinary life that had been built here in this house in the hill country in the year of the Lord 1878 and onward. The next morning, Myrtle was up before anyone else, as she always was, and she put the coffee on and stepped out onto the porch in the early gray light before the sun came up. The air was cool and smelled of cedar and wet grass, and the mockingbird was already going through its catalog, and the sunflowers lined the fence in the half-dark like patient sentinels. She stood there with her coffee cup, and she thought about everything. About Virginia and the farm and Thomas, and the years of teaching, and the long stretch of loneliness she had carried so practically and without drama. About the advertisement and the carpetbag and the borrowed horse, and the three young men lined up behind their father like fence posts. About the slow, careful, irreversible way this place had become hers, the way these people had become hers, not because she had claimed any of it, but because she had simply been present and honest and willing. She heard Jacob's step inside the house, the particular sound of him, which she knew the way you know the sounds of a place you belong to. He came out with his own coffee cup and stood beside her, and they looked at the ranch in the early light, the pastures rolling away toward the cedar line, the barn solid and good, the garden with its rows, the sunflowers along the fence, the whole quiet living enterprise of it. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood together while the sky lightened and the stars went out one by one, and the sun came up over the hill country, orange and gold and enormous, the way Texas mornings come, with complete confidence and no apology, and the light fell across the ranch and across the sunflowers and across the two of them standing together on the porch, and the day began. There was no version of this life that was without difficulty. There was work and weather and cattle and the ordinary complicated business of raising children and running a ranch and navigating the thousand small negotiations of a shared life. There were hard winters and dry summers and arguments and worries and the general unpredictability of things. But there was also this, the knowledge, solid as cedar and just as fragrant, that what had been built here could not be unmade, that what had been planted had taken root, that what had begun in suspicion and hostility and quiet grief had become, through patience and time and the willingness of everyone involved to be changed, something extraordinary in its ordinariness. A family, a home. A life worth every single hard mile of the road that had led to it. And Myrtle Sutton, who had arrived with a carpetbag and a letter and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from having nothing left to lose, and who had, one stubborn heart at a time, won her way into this place, and these people and this man stood in the morning light with her husband and her coffee and her ranch and her sunflowers, and she was entirely, completely, permanently home.